because we get to dwell in that one place and to explore it as fully as we possibly can, I think that Megan Kaminski is a wonderful person to lead us into the project. She's a professor of English and environmental studies at the University of Kansas, and her research and writing are focused on the places, the plants, and the environment that is all around us. According to her bio on the KU website, Megan's current writing project takes as its goal, quote, visioning new possibilities for reciprocity and community. So I haven't read anything from that new project, but I also see that same ethic of care in Megan's previous book called Gentle Women. So it's a little plug there. Um, so I was rereading one of its poems last night, and this poem kind of sent me to a Kansas farm in the winter, uh, seeing evidence of the byproducts of drilling for shale oil that I know and imagine to be compromising the land, compromising the landscape, but still in that moment trying to find a way to do something joyful. It's sort of what this poem takes us to. And then sort of following or associated with that joy is sort of finding a way to meaningful, to caring. And I think that that extends both, for ourselves and for the people and the things kind of all around us. So I'm excited to hear what Megan has to say. And then to you all who are able to stick around for the workshop afterwards to build on that. And so thank you all for coming, and please welcome Megan Kaminski.
Oh, thank you, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you all here in the little boxes. Thank you for that generous introduction, Andy. I'm actually teaching a class, co-teaching a class on care practices this semester, and I see at least one of my care practitioners here. Hi, Ellen. So yeah, that was just very fitting and a much appreciated introduction. So thank you. And thank you all for being here, especially at least in Lawrence right now, the weather is getting ready to take another cold turn. So I'm glad we can be here and be cozy together. So as I said, I am coming to you from Lawrence, Kansas, from the Kansas River watershed, which, like the state of Kansas, was named after the Kaw people, the traditional residents of this land who were forcibly removed to the Oklahoma Indian Territory. The city of Lawrence resides on the ancestral lands of several tribes, including the Kaw, Osage, and Kickapoo peoples, on land that was forcibly ceded in a series of treaties. The state of Kansas is presently home to 4 federally recognized tribes, Haskell Indian Nations University, and many other Native peoples throughout the state and here in town. I recognize this land and these histories as a small step towards acknowledging and countering past and ongoing colonialism and oppression, and an honor and respect for the Native peoples who are indigenous to the land where we reside, who were forcibly removed from and forced to this area, and who currently reside here. So I thought that was an important thing to think about as we're talking so much about place and what it means to be from a place. And I'm honored to kick off this Literary Landscapes in Kansas program tonight. And I am going to share with you a personal tour of literatures and places that helped me find a home here in Kansas. And another big thank you to Tina, Andy, New Territory, High Plains Radio, Humanities Kansas, just like perpetual awesome partner to the humanities. And with that, I'm going to share my screen with you. I put together a little PowerPoint presentation. Can you all see that? You good? All right. So listening to place, finding home. There are going to be 3 parts to my discussion this evening. First, just starting off with when I first moved to Kansas and the tallgrass prairie ecosystem almost 17 years ago. When that happened and when I first got here, I felt really adrift. This is now the longest place I've ever lived in my life. The only place that I really think of like thoroughly as an ongoing home, but at the time it was really jarring. I I was born in the driftless region of northwestern Illinois. I grew up in the wetlands of coastal Southern Virginia, and I spent my early 20s living in large cities across 3 continents. Coming from personal histories of displacement and disconnection from family and ancestral knowledges, I wasn't sure what it meant to be from or of a place. What I did know, though, was that I was ready to set roots and find a home. And as a poet, I, of course, looked back to the works of literature that shaped me and to the spark that gave my imagination as I was trying to find my way here. And I want to start with a little excerpt from Barbara Guest and her poem, her book length poem, The Countess of Minneapolis. Barbara Guest is an American poet and was considered a member of the first generation of the New York School. So she was writing in the second half of the 20th century. But in this book, The Countess of Minneapolis, the speaker says, "When shall I understand Minneapolis? If not grain by grain, at least loaf by loaf. If not the river flow, at least its turn and tributary." So just as guest speaker seeks to understand her new home through direct experience, I bristled against the sweeping generalizations of Midwestern nice and other platitudes that were offered in an effort to help me fit in by my fellow recent transplants at the university where I teach. I wanted to lay the world out piecemeal and flux as I experienced it, not through the kinds of dismissive stereotypes that rendered this place flyover country. I wanted to listen to the stories that the people here had to tell, and to hold space for things that breathe and grow and change. I wanted to work to connect, think about, and understand this new to me place. As I struggled to find belonging, to find a sense of belonging in my new life, I returned to practices from my childhood. I got out and explored. I found a replacement for my earlier relationship with the ocean, a place that felt so vast and powerful that my smallness in its presence connected me to a divine spirit greater than myself. I found the tallgrass prairie. I started going for long walks in the prairie preserve near Strong City. I began to pay attention to the sounds and textures and colors of the grasses as they changed with the seasons. I began to find a home in something bigger than myself. Some of you might recognize this one. This is from Willa Cather's My Antonia. I was something that lay under the sun and felt it, like the pumpkin, and I did not want to be anything more. I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel that when we die and become part of something entire, whether it is sun and air or goodness and knowledge. At any rate, that is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. When it comes to one, it comes as naturally as sleep. So this was, I'm completely a nerd and I went full out when I moved here and I was reading and watching everything I could about the prairie. And you know, I'm not the kind of person who just lets things happen. So this passage just really spoke to me. And from my relationship, my personal relationship with the prairie, I was able to continue from the sense of awe into a deeper set of relations. I observed and made friends with the plants and animals around me. I made friends with ethnobotanists, evolutionary biologists, prairie restorers, land rights activists, traditional knowledge keepers, and other folks who dedicated their lives to being with and learning from our unique ecosystem. I asked questions. I listened to their stories. I learned so much about the prairie and became part of its larger community. But still, the plants themselves remained my greatest teachers. And this is from Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, This is an essay some people haven't. I think it's not as widely circulated. It did not appear in Braiding Sweetgrass, but it's about the tallgrass prairie, and she writes about this. When I was a young ecologist, a girl from the forest on the way to the American Midwest, I confessed I didn't see what all the fuss was about prairies. I imagined a big field of unmown grass, one dimensional and dull as Midwestern people. I was wrong on both counts. The moment I slid into that head high flow and inhaled the grass perfume, all my senses recalibrated. I could see and hear and feel what I never could have imagined. Grass hung with tiny pink stamens and feathery stigmas attached to dew, the thrum of 1,000 bees, the brush of butterflies, the rising of flowers. Part 2, the call of place. Everything is collaboration. Whether we like it or not, we're in this life together. Our bodies team with microorganisms that participate in our growth, defense, digestions, and moods. The ecosystems we live within are comprised of an interconnected web of people, animals, plants, and various natural and man-made architectures. While we are surrounded by, acted upon, and composed by non-human beings and systems whose size and scale simultaneously exceed and elude our human ability to consider them, the texture of our everyday experience and relations on a local scale provide us a call to engage and encounter. In answering the summons into relation and care that place issues to us all. So I'm saying here that I think the places that we live in, the outdoor spaces, the larger ecosystems, that the animals and plants and land in those places are calling us into relation and calling us into relationships of care. And I think we just really need to listen to them. And I think in that listening, we can find practices that open us to think and feel and imagine with those more than human persons. So talking about plants and animals here. Like many others in the world during the first year of the COVID pandemic, I felt a debilitating sense of isolation and disconnection. Well, I was lucky enough, especially as someone in a higher risk for someone who was at higher risk for complications from the virus, to be able to self-isolate. I felt a great sadness in the loss of daily connections in my life that piled on top of the greater sadness in response to the massive loss of life around me. So I found solace connection in my relationships with my more than human neighbors. I went out into my backyard and started to make friends with the birds and listening to who was speaking at what time each day. I don't think I've ever n- known as closely the different stages of the plants, both in my backyard and growing around me. And I developed these relationships, and these relationships that I developed in isolation ended up becoming relationships that I wanted to share with other people. So this photograph is a photograph of a writing workshop led in the Lawrence Community Orchard. So, but I'm going to share a poem of mine with you now from this time, in speaking of these kinds of relationships and thinking back to maybe Tina's question, with new territory, thinking about how literature, how thinking about place, how we can develop these relationships. So, Under Tree Canopy, by oak leaf hydrangea, sipping creekside, watching fat bumblebees drunk and stumbling, in shade and shelter, our winter slow bodies quicken to heat, no longer afraid to take up space or yield to powdery blossom. Peonies, dogwood, and shining blue star, gentle teachers of sweetness, a stopping to breathe and soft touch. Maybe it's true that we are all alone together, able to imagine a variety of sadnesses other than our own, and in that seeing our chance to open to face the sun. Young robins chatter incessant, and willow leaves curl waxy green in fingers, providing company and counsel. How to fall over again and again and keep going. How easy to linger in the wayside, sip by water, and allow each verdant brush to transform seed into widely seedling, bud to pink flower. How to realize each expectant whisper in my own heart. And I'm not the only writer who looks to plants around them for lessons on how to live in this world. I want to share with you a little bit from the poet James Thomas Stevens next. In his poem, A Half-Breed's Guide to the Use of Native Plants, James Thomas Stevens combines drawings and poems of native plants from the tallgrass prairie. Upon beginning a faculty position at Haskell Indian Nations University, Stevens started visiting the tallgrass prairie in the nearby Flint Hills as a practice towards becoming acquainted to his new home in the Midwest. On those visits, he studied and sketched plants he found there and began learning more about them. Those initial drawings and fieldwork developed into the long poem that begins his second book, and the preface for which he describes drawing upon ancestral traditions and seeking guidance from plants. So this is from the preface. For centuries, the Haudenosaunee have looked to plants for their medicinal properties. The Mohawk sought out the choke cherry and crab apple, acorn shell, and birch bark. The Orenda, or life force, for lack of a better translation, came to the aid of our people. I too look to plants for inspiration. End quote. In thinking with prairie plants, Stevens encounters wisdom for living. The poems touch on family, love, the loss of his father, and what it means to be an artist, or as he later writes, a key to surviving the new old world. So I'm sharing you this poem about the scurfy pea. Some survive however they must, remaining small on the landscape to reduce transpiration, changing skins to curb reactions. They keep shallow roots and break from base, dispersing in danger to flee infestation. So in the book, sketches of the plants pair with brief poem reflections on the individual species' unique ways of encountering and living within the prairie ecosystem, providing guidance for the poet as he navigates his new home. The series culminates in 3 prose poems in which the poet integrates his newfound plant source wisdom into his own histories and personal embodiments, observing, quote, and leaving the prairie with empty hands, what I take in gifts is threefold. Therein lies the knowledge of the body, heart, and mind, end quote. The plants have provided care for the poet, not through using them as resources with extractable properties, but through thinking with them into new openings into relationality with his new home. In my own writing, I've been thinking with the plants of the tallgrass prairie, as well as the plants in my own backyard and neighborhood. This is a very unruly photograph of my backyard. I had some prettier ones, but I thought I should share the weedy overgrown version. So through close contact in planting and tending to plants in my yard and within my home, I'm a lover of houseplants. I've developed relationships of care through watering, weeding, occasionally applying fertilizer, etc. Like all gardeners, I began by observing what each plant needs to flourish. Which sunny spots do the large potted Norfolk pine prefer each season? When to trim the cup plants so they do not topple under their own weight in summer bloom. I learned this from my friend Kelly Kincher, that you can snip them off about a month before they bloom and keep them a little sturdier. And then they'll still blossom and they're beautiful. How to divide hostas and irises out so that their roots can find space. And these were things I didn't know before. I only became a plant lover, gardener upon moving to Kansas. Um, so working in close contact, splitting roots with my hands, noticing and caring daily led me into conversation and relation. I dissolved the role of the garden subject to the plant object. So the idea that, I was in charge and there were just these things I was doing stuff to, and instead opened into a deeper relationality. Through listening and care, I've developed individual relationships, conversing through hand and voice, water and soil, leaf and flower, breeze and song. And I'm saying this not because I think I have some special gifts, but because I think we're all engaging. Anyone who is engaging and caring for plants around us and paying attention, you're engaging in these acts of interspecies care. So part of what I think I'm doing with my project and my writing is thinking about naming those relationships so we can understand that we are engaging and we're connected to a whole family that's larger than just our own bloodlines or even our own species. So, listening to the call of place has brought me into relationships of care, both through caring for land and its inhabitants, and then also in the ways that land cares for me, providing subsistence through food and plants for medicine, and in sharing beauty and companionship into new ways of experiencing my own life. So I think when I'm talking about relationships of care, I'm not just thinking about responsibilities on our half. I'm thinking about the ways that caring for another person, another being makes our lives rich too, that it's a reciprocal relationship. So I've got one more of my poems for you, and this is one of my backyard poems. I think you can see the black locust tree I'm talking about in the very upper right corner. Where we are situated, high in the tree canopy, wind pushes branch into branch, a scrambling of touch, one limb becoming another. The morning gray and bright sun pushing through clouds, cars abating as the commute softens into mid morning blackbirds and the gnarled black locusts, doves on rooftops, squirrels chattering on and on. Picture a mammoth rubbing hide on bark, the sharp prick of thorns emerging as buffer. Picture seas and glaciers that once covered this place. Picture limestone erupting, bison grazing tall grass. Picture prairie grass, pink orchid, wood betony, large flowered coreopsis, prairie phlox, funnel form beard tongue, pale purple coneflower, lead plant, prairie blazing star, rattlesnake master, hoary puccoon, yellow wild indigo, and azure aster all flowering to open, my hands breaking into blossom, the fields, the grasses, the fields. Part 3, lessons from plants. Oh, I thought I had a picture. Oh, sorry about that. You're just going to have to imagine this, and maybe we can imagine this all together because I'm going to start with the description of the earliest spring ephemerals popping up. So maybe, I guess we don't want to conjure that in mid-January, but at least we can dream, dream until March, dream into March. Early each spring, tiny green stalks emerge from the ground, poking through last year's detritus of dried grass and disintegrating leaf, with signs of the reawakening that is to come. In Kansas, prairie violet, phlox, hoary puccoon, and wild strawberries are some of the first wildflowers to appear, coaxing us outdoors with their delicate and fleeting blossoms. Whenever we take the time to look and listen to the plants and animals that share our world, we see that they are calling us into relation. providing us with beauty, sustenance, and inspiration, and in turn, calling us to care for our common home. By refusing to relegate plants to the role of background or setting for human activity, we challenge Western notions that place humans outside and on top of the natural world. As Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about plants in her groundbreaking book, Braiding Sweetgrass, their wisdom is apparent in the way they live. They teach us by example. They've been on this earth far longer than we have and have had time to figure things out. Close quotes. So I'm going to close us out in this section with a short tour of the state, plant by plant, through the words of contemporary Kansas poets. And if you're really excited about these poems, they are part of the Humanities Kansas anthology, Wild Words. And there are actually 11 poems in that by 11 different poets. I will not read all of them to you. I'm just going to give you a sampling. So we'll take a mini tour around the state, starting in Topeka with the poet Gary Jackson. So Gary Jackson was born and raised in Topeka. He's the author of uh, 2 books of poetry, and he now teaches at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, which is where he lives. But this is a poem he wrote about the prairie violet. Morning, Viola pedicifida. Bloom and cleft again, into an open hand, not reaching up because you're too proud to need help. But those hands get around. Illinois, Minnesota, Kansas. Like me, they mistake you for wild, even when you are. You can be difficult and short-lived. Violet, you're after my own black heart, full of crow's feet and royal threaded veins, rich blood that will kill us one year. But today, you will keep company in prairies, climb up the scape, come back to Kansas, a place we rarely claim but claims us. I envy how you're close to the ground, solitary yet never alone. You've got plenty of feet to walk, to run, to drop seed and let go. 100 plum-colored palms greeting me hello. All right. And then we're going to go out to Liberal, Kansas, with Janice Northern, who is the author of 1 book of poetry, Some Electric Hum. And this poem is dedicated and inspired by the Eastern prickly pear. How to fall in love. When you look upon the plain's prickly pear, do you see flower or thorn? Will you be the one that pushes ever elsewhere, seeking always blossom around the next bend? Or you stop here, stop to mourn people and plants cast aside as trash? Here you tremble in a shadowed past as you water contradictions of the heart, but here you will grow to love the thorn, its fine, decisive point defending airspace, making way at last for the prickly pear's burst of blooms, velvet yellow flags holding steady in the southwest Kansas wind, like you staking their claim. And I think I'm going to stop here. There are many poems from this I'd like to keep reading, but I'm going to throw up my cat Brenda on the screen, who is my constant collaborator, and also my email address if you want to get in touch or chat. I love hearing from people about Kansas. So thank you so much for having me.
That was wonderful, Megan. Thank you so much. That was really beautiful. I love that you ended on the tour of Kansas. um, well, thank you, Megan. I am thrilled to hand it over really to Andy, who's going to talk more about literary landscapes. But everybody, please join me in thanking Megan. You can drop thanks in the chat or send her a message. We really appreciate it. Thanks again.